I've saved over $50,000 over the past 3 years by living in Seattle instead of SF. If you want to make the most out of your software engineering salary so that you can reach FIRE faster, you should do exactly the same, and here's why. The first and most important, and this cannot be understated, is Seattle does not have state income tax, whereas in comparison, California has one of the highest tax rates in the US. Now, on a salary of $150,000, not accounting for any deductions into your 401k, this comes out to a tax savings of approximately $11,000 a year if you're living in a state with no tax versus if you're living in California. Now, to put this into a different perspective, if you're working in Seattle and you make $150K a year, in order to make the same amount take home in SF or in California, you would have to be making over $168,000. Now, this difference in how much money you save by not paying state tax grows even larger the higher level up that you go and the more money that you make. So at $200,000, the amount that you save in taxes is closer to $16,000. But again, this is not accounting for contributing to your 401k or your HSA or whatever, which would actually reduce the amount of taxes you're paying in both situations, but obviously would have more effect in California. Now, all of this wouldn't matter that much if SF had a lower cost of living in Seattle, but as we all know, that is not the case. I know, and you probably know anecdotally, that SF is very expensive to live in, but just for the sake of argument, let's go through some examples that I found online. So the average rent prices according to the Zillow article shows that SF is 62% more expensive than Seattle. And based off Zumper, the average one-bedroom apartment in Seattle costs $2,000, where the average one-bedroom apartment in SF costs around $3,000. And if you take that at face value, living in Seattle, you're saving over $1,000 each month in rent. Now, of course, it's not that simple. In SF, you could be living with a ton of roommates, saving a lot of money and not paying that much in rent. But on the flip side, you can do the exact same thing in Seattle. I've been living in Seattle for the last 3 years. My first year, I paid around $1,600 a month in rent. And the 2 years after that, I've paid no more than $1,350 a month in rent. So making the argument that you could get a deal in SF doesn't really make that much of a difference because you could also get a deal in Seattle. Now, 1.4 San Francisco is that you don't need a car and it's a very walkable city. Looking up online, it has a walk score of 98, which is very, very good. It's probably one of the most walkable cities in America. Now, that being said, Seattle's a pretty walkable city as well, depending on where you live. The walk score that I've got when I searched online was 74. But I do think that this number is a lot higher depending on what neighborhood you live in. And I would argue in either situation, you could get away with not having a car in either city. But I will say for Seattle specifically, because I live here, a lot of the city does open up, and a lot of the things that you can do around the city, which makes the city actually pleasant to live in, really unlocks once you have a car, or at least a friend with a car. And from what I've heard from my friends who live in SF, it's kind of the same thing, right? Like if you have a car, you can take it on weekend trips out of Seattle to go hike. And it's a similar thing in SF. If you have a car or a friend with a car, you can take the Highway 1 down, go to Big Sur, or also do hikes as well. Now, another point that I want to make about cost of living is from this Numbeo article where they say that everything in SF is more expensive than in Seattle, including the rent. Now, to be honest, I don't know how accurate this is. And in comparison to how much you're going to be saving in rent and how much you're going to be saving in taxes, I think that these changes in how much you're paying for milk, for example, or how much you're paying for a night out is negligible in comparison. So in my opinion, I don't really think it's worth comparing that much, but I do think it's important to know. And it's been 3 years since I've graduated, but ever since I was in school from the very beginning to the end of school, the whole mantra, and I guess even now, has been Cali or bust, where the idea is all of the best salaries for tech are going to be in the Bay Area or around the Bay Area, and there's no other option. Especially coming from a Canadian school, that was the mindset that we had. But as Seattle's growing as a tech hub, that is simply not the case anymore. Based on levels.fyi, the salary differences between SF and Seattle is not that big, with the median software engineering salary in SF being around $250K, whereas in Seattle is around $230K. Now, what this means is the median salary in SF versus Seattle is 9% higher in terms of absolute numbers. But once you consider things like cost of living and taxes, I'm sure that these numbers are actually much more even, or in a lot of cases, Seattle is actually coming out ahead. So to illustrate this, here I have a chart that shows the median salary from levels versus the annualized price of the median one-bedroom apartment in SF in Seattle, and I've also thrown New York in there as well. As you can see in the blue, which is the difference, you're making more money based off the medians if you live in Seattle versus SF, and this is before accounting for state tax. Now, one point that I will give to SF is the robustness of their job market there and their tech market there. From what I've seen and from what I've heard and from all the job postings that I've seen, if you want to work at a startup, venture-backed startup, stealth startup, small startup, the place that you want to be is San Francisco. That's where all the VC money is. That's where all the best engineers are. And that is where the startup culture really is. And I think the same thing could be said for a lot of large companies there as well. If you look at Google, if you look at Meta, if you look at, I don't know, like Nvidia, all of their headquarters are in SF or in the Bay Area. The only really big companies that I can think of who have headquarters outside of SF is Microsoft and Amazon, which are both in Seattle. And when I say Amazon and Microsoft have headquarters in Seattle, I mean it really dominates the Seattle area. Everyone that I meet in Seattle is A, in tech, and B, works at Microsoft or Amazon. So in that sense, SF is very similar to Seattle, but in somewhat of a different font because they have more tech companies. Now, I honestly think that Seattle is where you want to be if you're talking in terms of just raw numbers in terms of salary. But of course, there are some major drawbacks to living in Seattle. Now, the first thing that I can think of is the Seattle freeze. So most of the people that I meet in Seattle are transplants, which means that people coming from outside in different states or sometimes different countries like myself, which on one hand is great because you have a lot of different people from a lot of different places. So it's kind of interesting. But on the other hand, I feel like since people are coming and going so frequently, a lot of people, once they make their friend group, they don't really want to let others in. And it's kind of cliquey and they kind of gatekeep because they understand that like there's a high chance that this guy's going to leave in like 2 years, right? So they don't want to put in the effort to make that relationship. So that on top of the weather makes Seattle kind of lonely at times. Now, I've definitely felt the Seattle freeze living here for the past couple of years, and I have friends who live in Vancouver, and I've also lived in Vancouver for a short amount of time, which also has the Vancouver freeze. So this thing might just be a weather dominated thing that happens in the Pacific Northwest. Which brings me to my next point, which is the weather. A lot of people say that Seattle rains all the time, and this is quite literally not an exaggeration. Based on this article, Seattle has rained 150 days of the 365 days of the year, which is just around 40% of the year where it rains. Now, the amount of precipitation that Seattle gets is actually not that much when compared to other cities. And if you look at this chart, it actually shows which cities are more wet than Seattle. Now, I'm not gonna lie, both of these articles and pictures that I've shown kind of feels like propaganda because it feels way rainier than this. And the reason it feels like this is because the sky is always dark, it's always gloomy, and on top of that, there's always just a constant little drizzle. It's just spitting at you a little bit. It really brings you down when you haven't seen the sun in literally a month at some points. Now, this type of gloominess, darkness vibes, twilight vibes, lasts for around 7 to 8 months of the year. And I'm not exaggerating, but those other 3 to 4 months in the summer are beautiful in Seattle. Seattle summers honestly are goated. Best summers I've ever had in my life. It's a nice temperature, like 20 to 25 degrees. There's a nice breeze coming from the ocean. And the sun is always out and it's not humid at all. Now, all of the best hikes that I've been on and all of the best nature that I've seen have been in and around the Seattle area. And in order to have those amazing hikes where, see all this greenery and these mountains, you're going to need a little bit of rain, or in my case, I perceive a lot of rain. Now, one other note that I want to make about the weather is with the amount of money that you're going to be saving in rent, you can use that extra money to just travel 2 or 3 months during when that time is really, really bad. And the third really big problem that I can think of is the homeless problem in Seattle. I mean, if we're doing comparisons towards SF, I think SF is as bad, if not worse, than Seattle. But I do think it's important to note that the homeless situation in Seattle is very bad and it's getting worse. Now, all this is to say, if you're from Canada or if you're from a different state and you're moving to the West Coast in order to make money, save, and invest for FIRE, I strongly suggest you consider Seattle over SF because if you're smart about it, you can save and invest a lot of money if you're in Seattle. Now, I've done a little bit of napkin math and comparing my cost right now to what I would need to pay in order to live a very similar lifestyle in SF, I think that over the past 3 years, I've saved well over $50,000 by living in Seattle instead of SF, which is a lot of money to be invested at the age of 20 if you're considering how long it has to compound and grow. Now, on the other hand, in the grand scheme of your whole entire life, this $50K that you're going to be saving for 3 years while living in Seattle is not that much when you stretch it out over the span of your whole entire career and you gauge it against your happiness. But in the grand scheme of things, if you're in the position where you have an option to pick between going to Seattle or going to SF, you are already in a very amazing situation, if we're being honest, right? So this 50K for a lot of people is probably not going to make that much of a difference through their whole entire lifetime. Now, I went to school in Canada, and when I graduated university, the majority of my friends who ended up going to the US went to SF. And to be honest, at times, it was pretty lonely living in Seattle. And now looking back, I don't think I would have been upset if instead of that 50K that I invested, if I had moved to SF instead, had a nice 3 years with my friends making a lot of memories. Because what is the point of having all this money, investing all this money, doing all this FIRE stuff, if at the end you have nothing to show for it? But if you're curious about how I was actually able to use that 50K that I saved by living in Seattle to really explode my net worth, you can watch this video right here where I talk about how much I saved, spent, and invested in 2023.